One thing that I've been opposed of is essentially reviewers and fandoms getting away with saying whatever and doing whatever. And this type of edgy behavior was quite normalized in these spaces. You could have someone like Grace Randolph promoting Lego movie fans to hate on DreamWorks Trolls because it isn't Lego movie. Random shit like that. You can have that. And this behavior was super normalized and it started to travel everywhere and it started to become really, really hard for both of these spaces to have proper conversations. And that's where we are currently speaking, like 2010s and even into the 2020s. This still goes on. At the same time, it doesn't help that you have those anti-SJW crowds adding more foolishness to an already foolish way of presenting your perspective. The problem with the term animation community being labeled onto oneself, and the reason why I personally feel like it's not good to label yourself as such, is essentially, let me give you an example. Spectre is a Unikitty fan. That means me, an individual person, likes Unikitty. Now let's change that. Spectre is a Unikitty fan in the animation community. Essentially, that second part, I'm no longer an individual person, I'm part of something big that lumps everything animation together into one. Not to mention the people in that community. You're no longer an individual person, you're part of something big. And it kind of removes oneself to be oneself, in my personal opinion. At the same time, the best way I can describe the animation community and all that it's been through in the past couple of years, especially pretty recently, is this is what happens. The best way I can describe the animation community is like a tree. You know the statement, a tree is known by the fruit it bears? That could be said for any fandom in general, but for the animation community, that's the best way I could describe it. Every apple, or whatever fruit you want to use, I'm just going to use an apple. Every apple represents people in the community, and the apples can also represent many different parts of animation, TV, movies, etc. Once a few bad apples fall from that tree, those bad apples fall from the tree. However, with that name, instead of the innocent apples or whatever fruit we want to use for this example, they don't stay in the tree. Every single fruit falls from that tree. We sweep all of the apples under a rug, the apples regrow again, and it's a vicious cycle that keeps repeating over and over and over again. Individuals can't be left out because of one or more people's foolish actions. Everyone is lumped together when you put yourself in that title of animation community. In my opinion, you're no longer an individual, and because of that, you're lumped into all of the foolishness that goes down. When I was younger, especially around 2011 when I got a computer for the first time and learned, oh wow, there are other animation fans like me making content, talking about animation stuff, a thing I enjoy, I wanted to be part of that circle, that network, the big group of apples in the tree. And it felt like a fun and inclusive, safe place. And that's because the early 2010s operated far differently than the late 2010s. The early 2010s, I like to call it the potluck era of the animation community, because essentially it felt like different walks of life came together. Instead of food, they brought animation. And essentially, everyone brought different shows, different movies. Everyone came together to have a responsible conversation. And because of that, people got to have a blast. No matter the perspective, no matter the differences, everyone was chill. There were no call-out posts. There were no people doing foolish actions with their narratives, talking about a certain piece of media. Everything was fine, everything felt essentially, as a normal review or just a person wanting to have a conversation, it felt normal. And that was missing. A normal conversation. Or, as I said earlier, a responsible conversation. And back then, there were people having irresponsible conversations, essentially doing what reviewers and fandom people were doing, essentially being foolish with their narratives and essentially saying and getting away with doing with whatever. However, back in the early days, those people did not get away with it. People called that out. They brought it to people's attention in the person in general and said, hey, listen, you need to improve, you need to do better, work how you communicate. And it was up to the person whether or not they did that. Now, here's the thing, though. You can't keep a watchful eye on people making really bad choices. And to an extent, it does feel like those people change the narrative. And that's kind of where animation spaces were in the late 2010s, was essentially, you can say and do whatever. You can get away with it. Nothing matters in the long run. And in a sense, in the course of the past couple of years, I've realized, as a preteen in 2011 and onward, I was not safe in this space. And the reason why was older teens and adults were abusing their platform. And essentially, it made it unsafe for, the kids. And by kids, I mean preteens and teenagers. But kids do slip in the cracks. We can't ignore that part. But, they weren't safe in the long run. Mostly because the grown people controlled the narrative. And if you had a different perspective, and you kind of knew there were some bullying in there or being completely offensive, you were essentially singled out. You were pretty much called, oh, you're just you're just a wee baby who's upset of perspectives. Oh, boo-hoo. When in reality, no, there were big problems with the way people were communicating and using their platform to talk about certain pieces of animated media. And, the one part of the demographic of animation, because it is family friendly after all, one part of the demographic of the community were essentially at a point where they were just completely silenced. They had no room in this conversation and no real room to make a change or say, hey, I have a different perspective, this is mine. No one really had a place to do that because the grown folk and older teens silenced the younger people. For me, I was in a different and weird and not so great place in 2018, but when I was experiencing media, I realized something very sad about myself. I wasn't watching and talking about media in the way Spectre would. I was doing it in the way the cartoon community would. And throughout the years, I've noticed, not other than me, I've noticed, a lot of my friends, they even notice themselves when they remove the cartoon community label, they realize They're starting to be themselves again. And the reason as to that is because when we left the potluck era of the animation community, where everyone was welcomed to communicate in the best possible way that was understandable for them and others, and, professionalism and, people that could speak animation lingo, everyone can speak, everyone could communicate, everything was a-okay, even differences, etc., etc. But in the later era, when people started to very much control the narrative, there was a sense of conformity. And a lot of people want to push that under the rug because of the famous statement among TV animation people: animation fans only talk about 3 shows and that's it. And to an extent, that is true. And at the same time, there was definitely conformity of how you should consume animation media. I mean, let's not forget, a lot of people came up with very archaic rules to enjoy TV shows and movies. And I think that in the long run, that harmed a lot of people. And at the same time, there wasn't a thing of opinion and people being in a huge minority having the same opinion. It became fact than opinion. And because of that, there wasn't really anyone kind of really truly speaking their mind. But at the same time, as I said in that last point, people were very silenced to do that. People wanted to be in this perfect little animation bubble, no differences, really no nothing. There wasn't room for anyone to really break free and say, hey, I'm different, But at the same time, being different was incredibly scary, because I can tell you, in the 2018, 19, etc., when I started to be myself again and be more open, removing trolls, because I was always open about being a fan of that, but when I was more open to say, hey, I really love Minions, animation fans would very much want to essentially not want to deal with me because that was not the status quo. And a lot of people are kind of noticing this, and it's just not fun. It's not fun to feel like you're not welcomed in a big, broad spectrum known as something called the animation community. A statement a lot of animation fans like to use is, it's the 2010s, sweep it under the rug, the community is in a much better place now. And I will say this. It's kind of true. I can say the animation community space is kind of better. I mean, that's the best way I could say it. It's kind of better. And I mean, while that's great and dandy, I don't agree with the statement of just sweeping the 2010s under the rug. A person like me cannot do that. I was very negatively affected by that in how I view media nowadays. I'm retraining my brain to remember how I watch media. And I'm not saying like past me, but like present me, learning what I'm interested in media and like knowing what I want to consume again and like how to properly communicate with others. I'm still struggling, but I'm learning to do better. And at the same time, it's hard to watch media nowadays. It very much is, because something new will pop up. I'll be excited, but when it comes down to the arrival of something, I'm nervous to watch it. That's why certain things, I wait a while until I'm ready to watch the thing. And even when I watch the thing, I get nervous to talk about the thing. Because, again, being silenced was something I got used to. Being afraid of having a different point of view, it scared me. So that's why I silenced myself. And even talking to friends, I'm still worried of the backlash. And that's not a good feeling. And I'm going to be stuck with that baggage for a very long while. At the same time, I do have to bring this up. Y'all know me, huge Trolls fan. In 2016, it was not a fun time to be a Trolls fan. I still had fun in my own way, but at the same time, I had to deal with the bullshit. And last year, I think it was last year. It feels like it was last year. I think it was last year, though. But normies brought up the singing killed my grandma, ha 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 ha, let's make fun of that. And I've had to deal with that shit since 2016. Not only me, but DreamWorks Trolls fans had to deal with that shit since 2016. And one of the biggest problems was that scene was not only viewed as a joke, and here's the thing, even as a Trolls fan, I can agree. Scene is a bit messy, but it's still a good scene to me. And it's an important scene for me because I can relate to that. At the same time, there were people very much dragging a narrative saying that this is not relatable. This is not realistic. And for me, that hurt me because I was curious and I had to question myself for many years as to whether or not my grieving experience that is similar to Branch was valid. I had to question whether or not my mental state was proper for grief. Over the course of time, I realized, yeah, no, I was. And I'm glad Trolls was able to tell me, no, your grieving experience was valid. Finding happiness in old and new friendships again to make me feel happiness again, that shit's valid as hell. But for the longest time, I had to deal with the fact of whether or not my grieving experience was relatable or some dumb shit like that. I had to deal with that for many years. At the same time, animation fans would just bully Trolls fans. And it was not a fun experience for not only me, but others around me that were Trolls fans. And it did not help that random people would use the ammo from animation community people from whatever statements they used about Trolls. They would use that against other Trolls fans to use that as ammo to attack others. Now, I'm not going to blame the animation community person, but I'm going to blame how they presented their perspective because it was a trickle effect. You know, one person heard it and then they used it as a bullying tactic. That shit was not fun for Trolls fans. We're in a little bit of a better space, but no, that shit was not fun. That was not a fun ride for any of us, but it especially was not a fun ride for me. One thing that I'm glad that I did last year was revisit the movie Sing. Because at the time when Sing came out, it was very scary to be an Illumination fan. It still is to this day because people decided to be foolish, bully others to make sure that people were silenced. It wasn't fun. And because of that, when I saw Sing, I loved it, had a great time. But when it came conversation time and see what others were saying, I went along with the crowd because I was already doing that. And because I had to hide that I liked Despicable Me and Illumination. Well, Despicable Me, Illumination, and Minions. I had to hide that. You know, I had to be a two-faced liar and say, haha, death to Minions, am I right? And for Sing, I had to go against my principles. Pop music is cringe. The movie was bad and made bad jokes. Death to comedies. And I wish I never did that. Because for the longest time, I forgot Sing. And because of that, when random animation fans would be like, hey, what are your thoughts on Sing? I lost track of my own thoughts on how I felt about Sing because other people influenced me, and not in the influenced way of, you made some points, my perspective has changed because of the way you spoke and stuff. That didn't happen. It was all out of fear and essentially not wanting to be different and fearing being different. Last year I rewatched Sing and I had a great time. I remembered why I really liked Sing in the first place. Funny enough, when I was listening to the Sing 2 soundtrack, one random thing popped up in my mind was, this is good and all, but is pop music cringe? And if you know me, I like pop music. And I can be critical when I want to be about pop music. But that narrative should have never popped into my brain. And that's mostly because animation fans came up with this very archaic rule of pop music. And honestly, one thing I realized was that's actually the wrong narrative to be saying for the longest time. It's actually radio play music should not be in animated movies. Because when you look into the soundtracks of most of these animated movies, a lot of them aren't pop. So already that was a red flag, realizing, oh shit, that's people have been lying to so many people for the longest time about that narrative. But I had to really think about that, and I could not use Sing 2 because I have not watched Sing 2. It's going to be a long hot minute until I see that movie. But I was able to use Sing 1 because NBC was playing it. I decided to use that question mark. And when I watched it, I was like, for me personally, this narrative doesn't really work. You know, you really got to put a lot of context and thought power to that. But I'm going to be honest, it made me think even more. Because Sing is all about, you know, being yourself, and all of these animals, I'm using most of them, for example, I'm using mostly the pop ones. They liked pop. Pop was a way for them to express themselves. At the same time, for a character like Mina, and also Rosita to an extent, they were afraid to do it, you know? And even Johnny, I'm gonna lump that boy, a good boy, in there as well. You know, they were all afraid to do it. And that made me question, has this narrative actually affected people very negatively? Have people actually forgot what they've enjoyed for the longest time? Has that affected them in ways of they didn't even imagine for the longest time? Has that hurt someone in the long run and they haven't gone back to the thing they loved because such of a weird ass narrative? It made me think about that. And because of that, that is quite scary to very much think about how these things became, like, honestly, like, not even like a big popular opinion, just kind of a thing that just became fact, something that kind of took over conversations, and honestly, like, very negative ways that like impacted like people's way of viewing media without really taking the time to actually question what's being said. You know, there was never the room or the time or the place. And for me, it made me kind of realize, you know, I really need to start doing my own thing, make my own path, do me, you know? And that's why I realized Spectre is not a cartoon community person. Spectre is a cartoon fan.